Joining us now to explain all this is author, pundit Satish Sharma. His book is called Caste, Conversion, A Colonial Conspiracy, What Every Hindu and Christian Needs to Know About Caste.
It's a pleasure to be with yourself, Jonathan, and also with Ravi, and thank you for that overly generous introduction. In 2013, something started to happen here in the United Kingdom. And in fact, what started to happen now in the United States is exactly where we were at that time. So you're at the beginning of a journey which here in the UK, British Hindus and the British public went through. Now, that journey here in the United Kingdom concluded very rapidly once the details that are contained in the book were published. Once we presented our position to government actually then said, oh, we agree with you. This is bad law. This is unevidenced. No impact analysis has been done. No consultation with the target community who would be primarily affected has been done. And so the government at that time said, no, we're not going to let this proceed. And they actually then held a public consultation. And the results of the public consultation were indisputable in that this problem did not exist. There was no evidence for it, and that what it was, it seemed to be an attempt to enshrine into law a prejudice. You know, a prejudice, strictly speaking, is holding an adverse opinion without having any evidence to support it. That's what a prejudice is. And yet this was an attempt to enshrine a prejudice into law. And so we here in the United Kingdom were really delighted to see that the evidence, historical and contemporary, that we'd presented, really it deconstructed this trope that was being peddled. And we're hoping to see the same there in the United States. It's the same rascals, it's the same troublemakers, the same agitators who failed here in the United Kingdom, who then turned their attention to community cohesion and to a community which was well integrated, is pretty much not troublesome, it's trouble-free, and yet all of a sudden a vast array of allegations, a deluge of them, have now been unleashed in the United States. And we're seeing that this is actually creating conflict. I'll be more than happy to go into more details as to how we dismembered and deconstructed the tropes that were presented here in the United Kingdom, because I think that that would benefit the audience as well as the persons who are being impacted upon by this particular act of mischief.
So when did it get to the States? That's what I ultimately want to know. And you mentioned these agitators. Who are these agitators? Who is behind this right now?
Well, if we're going to be specific, Equality Labs are the principal protagonists in this space. And behind Equality Labs, there is a group of funders, there is a group of supporters, and by and large, if we were to try and give them a label, it's the group who are extremely unhappy with the indigenous resurgence of the Hindu and the Indian identity that's occurring as India decolonizes. India is in a process of trying to reconnect with its civilizational identity prior to when the Christianist evangelicals from Great Britain descended upon India and wreaked havoc for the best part of 300 years. Those groups are still sadly very much present. They have vested interests in ensuring that the indigenous identity in India doesn't manage to reintegrate itself and doesn't start to openly talk about what was done to it. And so this is why we're seeing a global resurgence of this. It's a valid question which I put to the both to the church and also to the legislators. I asked them, there is so much in India. How come even an individual in the remotest part of the United States has heard of the word caste? You know, this doesn't happen by coincidence that a particular word or a trope appears without significant force. And there is the evidence is there to support that this has been deliberately proliferated. In fact, to really understand it, I think it helps to bring to bear an understanding of Goebbels' rules about propaganda. If you have a look at how propaganda and hate speech and hate tropes are created and then proliferated, all of a sudden, this whole exercise starts to take on a different shape. And then I think you start to see clearly the intent as well as the actors behind the intent.
Well, Pundit Sharma, you brought up a group that we've been covering for the last few years, Equality Labs, and we actually had a chance to have a conversation with the principal of Equality Labs, the founder and the executive director, Tenmosi Sunarajan. We got a chance to catch up with her after she won an award at the South Asian Bar Association. It was a social justice award, and in the aftermath of receiving that on stage, we had a chance to talk to her. I wanted to play a couple minutes of her comments to us after she received the award, and get your thoughts on what she's saying and the validity of her of this discussion, because it's widespread. And again, she has incredible influence here in the U.S. amongst a number of these organizations. Let's take a look at what Tenmosi Sunarajan has to say.
Talk a little bit about, most recently with the Google talk and everything that's come down the pipeline with the Santa Clara Human Rights Commission. Equality Labs has, some would describe as a controversial relationship within the South Asian community. How do you navigate that, and how do you, counter those who say that, specifically as it relates to Google, it was said that the work that you're doing is divisive. So how do you counter that?
Well, I think we've always seen civil rights struggles be met with a small group of bigots, people that want to stand opposite to the progress. And I think what's fascinating at this moment right now is that just like this award, there are millions of South Asian Americans that want to see caste discrimination end. So unfortunately, while there are those who are unhappy with Dalits being given equitable access to American institutions, overwhelmingly the South Asian community is unified in order to be able to add caste as a protected category.
Why add caste as a separate protected category?
Well, clearly, from our own data, we know that 1 in 4 Dalits experience physical and verbal assault, 2 out of 3 workplace discrimination, and 1 out of 3 educational discrimination. So there are times when our civil rights codes are not sufficient to meet the needs of communities that are facing deep and grave discrimination. So when we add caste as a protected category, caste-oppressed people are able to get our equal access under the law. And frankly, just my own experience at Google proved that. When I got this award, I was in a safe house because of bigots that wanted to make sure Dalit women couldn't come out and talk about the experiences we face around discrimination. So this is a civil rights journey that will not be denied, and I really encourage even those that feel threatened by the prospect of Dalits achieving equity, join us, because we do not want to pass this scourge to the next generation.
Now, Dalits are obviously a micro minority, and so are the larger South Asian community, the Hindus, the Muslims, the Sikhs within this community. We're all still minorities in this country. So how do you reconcile the fact that bringing caste as a protected category could potentially, disadvantage the Hindu American community, or the Sikh American community, or the the South Asian Muslim American community, which all have their versions of caste in it?
So civil rights laws are not set up to disadvantage any community. They're actually set up to ensure access for all communities. And with each of these multinational corporations, they already have caste as a protected category for their South Asian countries. They have simply omitted it for their North American divisions, even though they have high amounts of South Asians. But for a company like Google, that makes no sense. One team might have members in India, in the United States, and in Europe. So you should have one policy that addresses all of those communities, and we shouldn't have patchwork policies, because otherwise the companies are failing their duty of care towards caste-oppressed communities and religious minorities.
Pundit Sharma, thoughts on what Tenmosi Sunarajan had to say there?
Where does one begin? Okay, firstly, we reached out to the groups who were here in the United Kingdom wanting to enshrine caste into law. We repeatedly said, come and talk to us. If this phenomenon does exist, the first step should be, come and sit around a table with us, tell us what's happening, give us the evidence, because according to our lived experience in the United Kingdom, and when I say lived experience, I've been here for 55 years. I've worked with over 400 temples up and down the country. We have never had an instance where somebody has come forward and said, I've been denied entry or I've been discriminated in the public sphere or indeed in the private sphere on this basis. So we appealed to them. We said, come and sit and talk with us. They didn't do so. They refused to. Here in the United Kingdom, we have a community who notionally, according to the framework that Equality Labs are putting forward, would be classed as Dalits. And we reached out to that organization, over 27,000 members of this organization. And the response from their president was to us, we don't think of ourselves as suffering. Why on earth should we say we now want to subscribe to this sort of a framework? Our children are lawyers, they're financiers. Why on earth would we want to be bundled up into this little victim group that this group are talking about? And in fact, their contribution was one of the key determinants which empowered the government to reject this out of hand. And I also know that in the United States, there are groups which are in exactly the same position who say, stop pushing us into this pigeonhole. So there is an issue here. Somebody who genuinely wants to resolve a problem, you would sit down with the groups or the persons who are actually causing you a difficulty. They have not done so. Nowhere have they done so. What they have done is they have rushed with allegations, with stories of victimhood. This young lady has just said that they are subjected to physical abuse on the basis of some sort of an identifier in the United States. I would love to see the evidence. Has any person actually come forward in the United States and said, I have been physically targeted and abused because of my identity? Has it been proven? Has it come in front of justice? You see, the bigger picture is that you have United States citizens, and the benefits of being a citizen in a country is that you're entitled to equality in front of the law. And those citizens who are Hindus in the United Kingdom and in the United States are actually being deprived of their right to be treated as innocent prior to being proven guilty. This was also a fundamental aspect of this attempt to enshrine the notion of some hierarchical system into law, and that was also accepted by the legislators. You know, we all have a desire not to see anybody suffer in the manner in which has been described, but equally, we do not want to see the creation of consciousness of this trope in our communities and our generations. And the work that I did, we proved and demonstrated exactly the mechanism whereby caste consciousness was created as typical standard divide and rule politics that the British played all over the world. And they accepted that the evidence was irrefutable as well. So although this young lady is appealing to our better sense, and, you know, it triggers compassion when you hear a young lady actually taking that approach and claiming victimhood. Each of us wants to leap forward and say, no, this is wrong. But when you then scrutinize the evidence, when you then ask to sit and have a conversation, you will find that the table is actually remarkably empty. And this is a real problem. This is the creation of a problem, the creation of consciousness of a problem where no problem exists.
And this is the exact playbook we're now starting to see in the States. And I want to, before we get into that, because very few, especially in the mainstream media, will even follow up and scrutinize the allegations or the claims, right? And we move on, and then this narrative starts to form. And again, just in the past few years, I want to get down to the timeline. When do you believe this came over to the States?
I would say we're in 2022. I'd say 2017 was the first time that I heard rumblings of this.
Actually,
And
I think
as
we're
I,
in 2023 now, at least the early parts.
sorry, 2023.
Right.
As
What
I,
I'm asking is, you know, as we know, this global movement back in roughly 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement, it really was a racial reckoning in the U.S., right? And again, the Black Lives Matter, you know, ended up, as we now know, at least the global nonprofit is accused of fraud. Um, but what came about from that is that so many different groups with different agendas decided to use that as a rallying cry. And I'm just wondering, do you feel like this movement that was started really in the UK sort of really started, you know, gaining more relevance and a voice with every other social justice protest and movement that was exploding in the US around that time?
I think there is a distinct strategy to try and camouflage themselves amongst the company of people who have genuine complaints. And the African American experience is a horrific episode in human history. the experience of the indigenous Americans is a horrific episode in human history, and they have absolutely valid claims, which this group does not have the pedigree nor the credibility. It hasn't established that those claims are real. What it has done is engaged in an extraordinary exercise of propaganda and of proliferating and creating the problem themselves, which they are supposedly wanting to see disappear, and then somehow have attached themselves to emotionally connected themselves with groups who have a very real complaint. And it's a very worrying trend. The data is the only thing that I think can salvage this situation. If we focus on demanding a very credible level of data, then you will find that this whole escapade dissipates. And in fact, the sooner we can do that, the sooner we can detach them from the legitimate claims and the legitimate pursuit of justice, which many other groups are pursuing. But it's a disingenuous and it's a tragic, and I would say it's a very, very unpleasant and cynical way of appropriating somebody else's suffering purely and solely to propel your own political motives.
Let me take the counter view here, Pundit Sharma.
Please.
Obviously, she has an incredible knowledge of what it takes to appeal to DEI executives, folks that are trying to bring more an inclusive America, to bring people together. So the language is there, but she also uses very strong language like bigotry, and I don't think anyone wants to be called a bigot. And so, thus, here we are. When someone comes to you and says, "Listen, this is a way to eliminate bigotry and hate," most executives will go along with that. So, what do you have to say then about the fact that here we are as three men arguing this case? She's going to point to a lot of women that are traumatized, that are victimized. There are a lot of folks of ostensibly backgrounds that are not elite that are facing challenges. Speak about that, because this is, I think, where largely this is going to, because the Indian community, in particular in the United States, came here to get master's degrees, PhDs, became part of the elite workforce, and we did not have folks, just kind of the common folks, so to speak, enter the United States until much later on. We had truly talented people that were brought to the U.S. first and foremost. So what do you have to say to some of those arguments that she will make?
It's wonderful. I would love to see the evidence, but just consider what's being done. How do you stigmatize a community? You create some sort of an allegation, you produce a victim, you create a hierarchy, you create some sort of, you identify some sort of difference, and then you infuse it with passionate appeals to emotion. This whole exercise immediately stigmatizes every Hindu who is not a Dalit. Is that just? And it's so obvious. When we were having this conversation here in the United Kingdom, I even suggested to the legislators, I said, look, if this phenomenon exists, the word caste is Portuguese, it means class. If you genuinely want to get conflict that is enshrined in some sort of class hierarchy, put the word class in. We'd be really happy, and everybody then gets additional protections. Imagine putting that word class in, because class is the English equivalent of the word caste, and it would give everybody the justice that they're seeking. And then we could turn to the phenomenon itself and see whether it exists and apply justice on that benchmark. They refused. They said, no, it has to be caste. Why? Because in everybody's consciousness, caste is a brand. It's a hate brand which is attached to a particular community. And their adherence and determination not to abandon the word caste and take a preference for the word class, it does reveal a great deal about who the target of this exercise is.
So I want to talk about what's happening really on the front lines then, outside of
Sure.
academia, outside of the diaspora. You have folks now, especially on the East Coast and West Coast here in the States, in academic circles and schools, also in tech circles, who, again, are not Indian or South Asian. And they're like, what are you guys talking about? But the moment I then say class, then they start to understand. And then they'll also say, oh, wait a second. We're having those issues as well in the U.S. It's just not called caste. So it's really interesting. So at this point, where do you feel like this conversation is going to go? Because it's such a big deal, again, in this diaspora, and that's why we're talking about it right now. But outside of it, I'm asking because aside from Equality Labs, we have another massive voice here in Rutgers University professor Audrey Truschke, who is a white woman who is at the forefront of this and pushing this agenda. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, we've been monitoring her work for a long period of time, and again have sought many opportunities and created opportunities to engage in an academic conversation, to have a look at the history, to have a look at the scriptures which supposedly provide the foundations for this ideology, and somehow which seem to perpetuate it across the centuries. And every single opportunity is rejected. There is no participation in any academic fora. It is classic trope construction. And it's only a question of time before the truth and the irrationality behind these escapades is revealed in front of everybody. As we managed to do it here in the United Kingdom, it took us 2 years. And when we presented everything and made it so clear that we were very much determined ourselves to prevent any prejudices, to prevent any discrimination occurring, all of a sudden it dissipated. It took us from 2013 to 2016 to do that. And then all of a sudden, lo and behold, the same phenomenon seems to have sprouted in the United States. So we don't have any issue in dealing with this particular campaign. It is nothing other than proliferating a hate trope with the intention of stigmatizing one religious community by name. And like all hate tropes, I think when they are subjected to the scrutiny of wise, calm, genuinely independent, unbiased scholars, academics, and litigators, they dissipate, and this too will dissipate. And personally, I think it's a wonderful thing. If it dissipates in the United States, then we will see this whole campaign, this pogrom of stigmatization of the Hindu community, collapse globally.